The sun was setting as Monique Wilson drove through the quiet streets of Oakwood. The orange glow behind the trees made her squint slightly as she turned onto Maple Avenue. She'd been at the hospital since 5 in the morning, her blue scrubs now wrinkled after a 12-hour shift. 3 surgeries back to back, the last one on a 6-year-old boy with appendicitis. He'd be fine now, and thinking about his relieved parents made her smile despite her exhaustion. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Probably her husband wondering what she wanted for dinner. She ignored it, keeping both hands firmly on the wheel. After 15 years of marriage, he knew her well enough to start cooking something healthy when she was running late. Tonight, she just wanted to kick off her shoes, hug him tight, and maybe watch that new show everyone at work kept talking about. The lights flashed in her rearview mirror suddenly, red and blue splashing across her tired face. Monique checked her speed out of habit, though she knew she hadn't been speeding. 65 in a 65 zone. She signaled and pulled over carefully, the gravel crunching under her tires as she came to a complete stop on the shoulder. What now? She whispered to herself, fishing her wallet out of her purse. She'd had a long day saving lives, and now this delay. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach. Tall guy, buzz cut, sunglasses despite the fading light. His hand rested near his holster as he walked, something that always made her nervous, though she'd never had any real trouble with police before. Monique rolled down her window and smiled politely. "Good evening, officer." The officer, Brennan, according to his nameplate, didn't return the smile. License and registration. No please, no explanation for the stop. She handed over her license. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Brennan's jaw tightened. "You rolled through the stop sign back at Pine and Oak." Monique frowned slightly. She clearly remembered coming to a complete stop there. It was right by the elementary school, and she always stopped fully, even when school wasn't in session. But she kept her voice even. "I'm certain I stopped completely, sir." The officer's posture changed, almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted slightly. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Monique felt her heart beat faster, but kept her expression neutral. 15 years as a surgeon had taught her to stay calm in tense situations. "May I ask why that's necessary?" "I'm just heading home from my shift at Memorial. I'm a pediatric surgeon there." I said, "Step out of the vehicle." His voice had an edge to it now, louder than before. A couple walking their dog on the sidewalk slowed down, watching the interaction with concerned expressions. Monique took a deep breath. "Officer, I'd like to call my husband, please. He works in law enforcement and can—" "Out, now." Brennan's hand moved to his holster, his face flushing red. Mrs. Patel, an elderly neighbor Monique recognized from community meetings, had stopped on the sidewalk and was openly watching now, her phone in her hand. 2 teenage boys on bikes had also paused across the street, whispering to each other. "I'm unbuckling my seatbelt," Monique said clearly, moving slowly and deliberately. She pressed the emergency contact button on her phone as she set it down, a feature she and her husband had set up years ago but never thought they'd need to use. Before she could even finish unfastening her seatbelt, Officer Brennan yanked her door open, his patience apparently gone. "I'm complying, officer," Monique said, her doctor's voice steady and clear. "There's no need for—" The officer's hand shot forward, grabbing her arm roughly. I said, "Now." Mrs. Patel gasped, her phone now definitely recording. The boys across the street had their phones out too. Monique didn't resist as she was pulled from her car, but when her foot caught on the doorframe, Officer Brennan seemed to take it as defiance. His open hand connected with her face with a crack that echoed through the quiet street. The world spun for a moment as Monique felt herself falling. Her cheek burned as she hit the pavement. In the distance, she heard Mrs. Patel shouting something, the boys yelling too. But clearest of all was the sound of her phone inside the car, the call connecting to her husband at the FBI office across town. The world stopped for a moment as Monique felt the rough pavement against her cheek. Her medical training kicked in automatically. No blood, probably just bruising, maybe some scraping. But the shock of being struck was still working its way through her system. "Don't move." Officer Brennan shouted, though Monique hadn't tried to get up. She could taste dirt and the hint of blood where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek when he hit her. I'm not resisting, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent street. Mrs. Patel was fumbling with her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to dial someone. The teenage boys had moved closer, their phones held high, recording everything. Just following procedure, ma'am, Brennan said, his voice suddenly calmer, more professional. He must have noticed the growing crowd. You failed to comply with a direct order. I was complying, Monique said, still not moving from where she lay. I was unbuckling my seatbelt when you pulled me out. Brennan's response was to roughly grab her wrists, yanking them behind her back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her skin as he clicked them shut. Too tight. She could feel her fingers starting to tingle from restricted blood flow. Officer, the cuffs are too tight, she said, trying to keep her voice level. Her hospital ID badge had fallen onto the pavement beside her face. Dr. Monique Wilson, pediatric surgery. The photo showed her smiling, confident, wearing the white coat she worked so hard to earn. Sure they are, Brennan muttered, pulling her up to her feet with a rough jerk that sent pain shooting through her shoulders. They all say that. More cars were slowing down now. Someone had rolled down their window to film. Across the street, a man in a business suit had stepped out of his house, phone to his ear, speaking urgently. My husband is on his way, Monique said quietly. He works for the FBI, Civil Rights Division. For a split second, something flickered across Brennan's face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. But it was quickly replaced by a smirk. Yeah, right, and I'm the president. He pushed her toward his patrol car, his hand gripping her upper arm so tightly she knew it would bruise. Inside her own car, her phone was still connected to her husband. Everything being said was being heard at the FBI office across town. What's going on here? A new voice entered the scene, Mr. Washington from the house on the corner. A retired high school principal, he walked with a cane but moved with purpose toward them. Monique, is that you? Stay back, sir, Brennan ordered, his free hand moving to his holster again. I know this woman, Mr. Washington continued, undeterred. She saved my grandson's life last year. What are you doing? Police business. Step back, or I'll have to detain you for interfering. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now. The evening news played out live on their quiet street, a black woman in scrubs, handcuffed and bruised, surrounded by increasingly concerned neighbors. She rolled through a stop sign. Officer Brennan announced loudly, as if trying to justify the scene to the growing crowd, then refused to comply with orders. That's not true, called one of the teenage boys. We saw the whole thing. She was just unbuckling her seatbelt. Brennan's radio crackled. A voice asked for his status. Situation under control, he responded, though the sweat now visible on his forehead suggested otherwise. Just a routine traffic stop. Nothing about this felt routine anymore. The growing crowd of neighbors, the phones recording, the way Brennan's eyes darted around nervously. It had all spiraled far beyond a simple traffic violation. In the distance, sirens wailed. Not just one, but several, growing louder by the second. Monique took a deep breath. She knew who was coming. Her husband had heard everything through her phone. He would have called it in, backup, witnesses, everything by the book. That was who he was. Methodical, thorough, protective. 3 black SUVs turned onto the street, followed by 2 police cruisers. Officer Brennan's hand fell away from Monique's arm as he watched them approach. The lead SUV stopped directly in front of them, its door already opening before the vehicle had fully stopped. A man stepped out, badge already in hand, his face a mask of controlled fury. Monique's husband had arrived. Special Agent Anthony Wilson, he announced, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. He didn't shout, but every word rang clear. FBI Civil Rights Division. Officer Brennan's face went through a series of emotions, disbelief, then fear, then an attempt at professionalism. Sir, this is a local police matter. We have everything under control. Anthony's eyes flickered to his wife's face, taking in the reddening mark on her cheek, the awkward angle of her shoulders from the too tight handcuffs. Something dangerous flashed in his expression, but his voice remained steady. Remove those handcuffs from my wife immediately. Brennan hesitated, looking around as if for backup, but the other officers who had arrived with Anthony were already speaking with witnesses. Mrs. Patel was showing one of them the video on her phone. The teenage boys were surrounded by agents taking their statements. She was resisting arrest. Brennan tried, but his voice wavered. Failed to comply with. I have the full recording, Anthony cut in, holding up Monique's phone, which one of his colleagues had retrieved from her car. The call connected to my office. Every word, every sound. We heard it all. The color drained from Brennan's face. His hand moved slowly to his keys. Now, Anthony added, his patience visibly thinning. Brennan fumbled with the handcuffs. When they finally clicked open, Monique brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing her wrists where angry red marks had formed. Anthony stepped forward, placing himself between his wife and the officer. "Are you okay?" he asked her softly, his public persona dropping for just a moment. Monique nodded, though the throbbing in her cheek said otherwise. "I'm fine." One of the other FBI agents approached, a woman with a notepad already filled with writing. "We've got 8 witnesses so far, all saying the same thing." She was complying, unbuckling her seatbelt when he pulled her out and struck her. Anthony nodded, then turned back to Officer Brennan. "Your body camera footage." Brennan swallowed hard. "It malfunctioned." "Convenient," Anthony replied. He didn't raise his voice, but the single word carried enough weight to make Brennan take a step back. "We'll be requesting the dashcam footage from your vehicle and all the security camera footage from these houses." He gestured to the homes lining the street, several of which had visible doorbell cameras. By now, the chief of police had arrived at the scene, a stocky man with graying hair and a deeply concerned expression. He took in the scene, the FBI agents taking statements, the crowd of neighbors, Monique's bruised face, the growing look of panic on Officer Brennan's face. "What in God's name happened here, Brennan?" the chief demanded. Before the officer could answer, Anthony stepped forward. "Chief Thompson, we need to talk. Your officer assaulted my wife during a routine traffic stop that appears to have been unwarranted in the first place." The chief's frown deepened. "Dr. Wilson?" he asked, recognizing Monique. "The surgeon?" Monique nodded, still rubbing her wrists. "She saved my daughter's life 2 years ago," the chief said, almost to himself. He turned to Brennan with fire in his eyes. "Your badge and gun. Now." "But sir." "Now, Brennan, you're on administrative leave pending investigation, effective immediately." The crowd of neighbors murmured their approval. Mr. Washington thumped his cane on the ground. About time someone held him accountable. He's been terrorizing this neighborhood for months. As Officer Brennan reluctantly handed over his badge and gun, a paramedic approached Monique, medical bag in hand. "Let's take a look at that cheek, doctor." Anthony placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." Monique looked around at the scene. FBI agents documenting everything, neighbors sharing videos, the chief of police personally handling the situation. A simple drive home from work had turned into something much bigger than herself. Anthony placed a plate of toast in front of her. He hadn't slept either. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he looked at her injury. "You should eat something," he said gently. She nodded but didn't reach for the food. "The hospital called. They want me to take a few days off." "Good, you need rest." Monique shook her head. "What I need is to not feel like this, like a victim. I save lives for a living, Anthony. I've held children's hearts in my hands, and yesterday I was thrown to the ground like." Her voice trailed off as the doorbell rang. Anthony squeezed her shoulder before going to answer it. He returned with Special Agent Diane Chen, his colleague from the Civil Rights Division. Diane carried a laptop under one arm and a thick folder in the other. "Sorry to interrupt your morning," Diane said, her eyes lingering sympathetically on Monique's bruised face. "But we got the dashcam footage from Brennan's patrol car. I thought you'd want to see it right away." Anthony nodded. "Let's go to the study." Monique followed them down the hallway, her tea forgotten. The study was Anthony's home office, walls lined with law books and family photos. She sat on the small sofa while Diane set up the laptop on the desk. "It's not pleasant to watch," Diane warned, hitting play. The footage showed everything from the moment Brennan had pulled Monique over. The camera angle captured her car and part of the interaction through the window. There was no audio for the first few seconds, then suddenly it kicked in. "He turned off his microphone at first," Diane explained. but forgot to turn it back on when things escalated. Department policy violation number 1. Then came the moment when Brennan yanked open the car door. The camera captured Monique clearly saying, "I'm complying, officer," her hands moving to her seatbelt. What happened next made Anthony grip the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles went white. The strike was visible, forceful, deliberate. "We've enhanced the audio," Diane said, tapping a key to replay the moment after Monique fell to the ground. This time, they clearly heard Brennan mutter, "That will teach you to know your place." Anthony's breath caught. Monique closed her eyes. "There's more," Diane said softly, forwarding the video, "when he thought no one could hear while putting you in cuffs." The enhanced audio picked up Brennan's voice again. "FBI husband? Yeah, right, you people always making up stories." The video continued, showing the growing crowd of neighbors, then the arrival of the FBI vehicles. Diane paused it. "We've got enough for federal charges," she said. "Civil rights violations, excessive force, lying in an official report." The dashcam contradicts everything in his written statement. Monique stared at the frozen image on screen, herself in handcuffs, Anthony stepping out of his vehicle, the neighbors with their phones raised. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build the case," Anthony said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Not just against Brennan, but against the department. Mr. Washington was right. This wasn't Brennan's first time. We've already found 7 similar complaints filed against him in the last year alone, all dismissed." "The police chief is cooperating fully," Diane added. "He's horrified. Turns out Brennan's direct supervisor was burying the complaints before they reached the chief's desk." The phone rang, and Anthony picked it up. After a brief conversation, he turned to Monique, his expression grave. "That was Channel 8 News. Someone sent them the neighbor's video. It's going viral." Monique took a deep breath. Her world had changed in less than 24 hours, from respected surgeon to victim to what now? "Good," she said finally, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "People need to see. This can't keep happening." Anthony knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "This is going to be a long fight." Monique looked from her husband to the frozen image on the screen, then to her own reflection in the window, a doctor with a bruised face and a new purpose. Wilson's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News vans lined their street, reporters camped on neighbors' lawns despite the light rain that had been falling since morning. The video had spread like wildfire, over 10 million views across social media platforms, shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people alike. Monique sat in their living room, blinds drawn, watching drops of rain race down the window. The bruise on her face had evolved into shades of purple and yellow. The physical pain had mostly subsided, but something deeper remained. A heaviness in her chest that made it hard to breathe sometimes. "You don't have to do this," Anthony said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "We can reschedule the press conference." Monique shook her head. "No more hiding. No more waiting. I need to speak for myself." The doorbell rang, and Anthony opened it to reveal Chief Thompson, soaked from the rain despite his umbrella. His face was haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," Anthony said, letting him in. The chief nodded grimly. "The internal investigation is complete. I wanted you to hear the results from me personally before the press conference." They moved to the kitchen table, where the chief pulled out a folder. Officer Brennan had 17 complaints filed against him in the last 3 years. 15 of them were from black or brown citizens. The chief's voice was tight with controlled anger. Lieutenant Parker buried most of them. The few that made it to review were dismissed without proper investigation. "Systemic failure," Anthony said quietly. "Yes," the chief agreed, surprising them both with his candor. "A complete failure of oversight and accountability. The department failed your wife, and it failed our community." He turned to Monique. "I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Wilson. What happened to you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed it." Monique studied the man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "What happens now?" "Brennan has been terminated, effective immediately. Lieutenant Parker has been suspended pending further investigation. I've requested a complete federal review of our policies and practices." The chief hesitated. "I'm also announcing my retirement after the transition. The department needs new leadership." The clock on the wall showed 1:30 p.m. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock. "It's time," Anthony said gently. The rain had stopped by the time they arrived at City Hall. A podium had been set up on the steps, microphones clustered like metal flowers. Cameras clicked rapidly as Monique stepped up, Anthony and Chief Thompson flanking her on either side. She hadn't prepared a speech. She'd spent years in operating rooms making split-second decisions with children's lives in the balance. She would speak from the heart. "My name is Dr. Monique Wilson," she began, her voice clear despite her nervousness. 3 days ago, I was driving home from saving a child's life when I was pulled over, assaulted, and handcuffed by a police officer who saw my skin color before he saw my humanity. The crowd fell silent, cameras still clicking softly. "I am a pediatric surgeon. I am a wife. I am a community member. I am a black woman. None of these things should make me a target." She touched her bruised cheek gently. "This mark will fade, but the memory won't. Not for me, and not for the millions who saw what happened." She looked directly into the main camera. "Officer Brennan's actions represent a larger problem, one that has been hidden for too long. Today, I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has ever been afraid during a traffic stop. For everyone who wasn't believed. For everyone who didn't have an FBI husband or neighbors with cameras or the privilege of a title before their name." Anthony stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on her back. "Change doesn't happen with one press conference or one firing," Monique continued. "It happens with accountability, transparency, and a commitment to justice that doesn't waver when the cameras leave." A reporter called out, "What do you want to see happen next?" Monique looked at Chief Thompson, then back to the crowd. "I want a police force that protects everyone equally. I want officers who de-escalate instead of assault. I want a system that holds wrongdoers accountable, no matter what uniform they wear." She paused, her voice strengthening. "And most of all, I want every person who has ever been silenced to know that their voice matters. Their story matters, and change is coming." Monique stood in front of her bathroom mirror, gently touching the fading bruise on her cheek. The angry purple had mellowed to a yellowish shadow, barely visible under makeup. The physical mark was healing, but its impact continued to spread far beyond her face. Her phone buzzed with another notification. She'd stopped checking social media after the first few days when the video went viral. The comments section was a battleground she wasn't prepared to enter. Instead, Anthony had hired a media consultant to manage the overwhelming public interest in their story. "Ready?" Anthony called from downstairs. Monique took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and headed down. Today wasn't about interviews or press conferences. Today was about something much more important. They drove in silence to the courthouse, where a small crowd had already gathered. Some held signs with Monique's face and the words "Justice Now." Others simply stood in silent support. The Wilsons slipped in through a side entrance, guided by their attorney, a woman with kind eyes and a reputation for winning civil rights cases. In the courtroom, Officer Brennan sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller somehow in his civilian clothes. His attorney leaned close, whispering something in his ear. Lieutenant Parker sat a few rows back, also facing charges for his role in suppressing previous complaints. "All rise," the bailiff called as the judge entered, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair. The preliminary hearing began with the prosecution presenting evidence, the dashcam footage, the neighbors' videos, the hidden complaint files, the testimony of other victims who had come forward after seeing Monique's story. When it was Brennan's turn to enter his plea, he stood slowly, avoiding eye contact with the Wilsons. "How does the defendant plead?" the judge asked. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Brennan's attorney answered. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Monique felt Anthony's hand tighten around hers. "Order," the judge said firmly, gaveling the room to silence. She set the trial date for 3 months later and denied bail for Brennan, citing flight risk and the seriousness of the charges. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shouting questions. The Wilsons' attorney stepped to the microphone. "Today is just the beginning of the justice process," she said. "My clients are committed to seeing this through, not just for themselves, but for everyone who has faced similar treatment without the resources or platform to fight back." Monique stepped forward, surprising both her attorney and husband. The reporters fell silent, cameras focused on her face. "I went to medical school because I wanted to heal people," she said simply. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But now that I am, I refuse to waste this moment." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "This morning, we filed paperwork to create the Wilson Justice Initiative. This foundation will provide legal support to victims of police misconduct who don't have an FBI husband or viral video to help their case be heard." The crowd erupted in applause and questions. Through the noise, Monique spotted Mrs. Patel, the elderly neighbor who had first recorded the incident. The woman gave her a small nod of approval. Later that evening, back home in their kitchen, Monique finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. She slumped into a chair, exhausted. "You were amazing today," Anthony said, placing a cup of tea in front of her. "I'm tired," she admitted, "but I can't stop now." Her phone rang, the hospital calling. After 2 weeks of administrative leave, they wanted to know when she returned to surgery. "I miss my patients," she said after hanging up. "I miss saving lives in the operating room. But right now, there's a different kind of healing that needs to happen." Anthony nodded, understanding. One doesn't have to replace the other. You can do both. Monique sipped her tea considering this. Outside their window, the last news van was finally pulling away from their street. But she knew they'd be back tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Her life had been forever changed by a traffic stop and an officer who made the worst mistake of his career. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed so tight that people stood along the walls. The trial had captivated the nation, becoming a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equal justice. Today was the verdict. Monique sat in the front row, Anthony beside her. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back, her face fully healed now with no visible signs of what had happened that evening. But the invisible changes ran deep in her community, in the national conversation her case had sparked. "All rise," the bailiff called as the judge entered. Everyone stood. Monique caught a glimpse of Officer Brennan at the defense table. He'd lost weight during the trial, his uniform replaced by an ill-fitting suit, his face pale and drawn. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she was surprised to find she felt nothing, not anger, not fear, not even satisfaction. Just a calm certainty that this moment mattered. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked after everyone was seated. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged plumber who had wept openly during Monique's testimony. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom held its collective breath as the verdict was read. "On the count of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, we'd find the defendant guilty." A murmur rippled through the room. "On the count of assault and battery, we find the defendant guilty." The murmur grew louder. "On the count of filing false official statements, we find the defendant guilty." Anthony reached for Monique's hand, squeezing it gently. Brennan's head dropped as the final charges were read, each met with the same response: guilty. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood slowly. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "I've had a lot of time to think. About what I did. About why I did it." His eyes found Monique's again. "I'm sorry, Dr. Wilson. There's no excuse for how I treated you." The judge studied him for a long moment, then delivered her sentence: 8 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 5. As Brennan was led away, Monique felt the weight of the past 6 months begin to lift. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Not just reporters this time, but community members, activists, families with children, off-duty medical staff from Monique's hospital. They cheered as the Wilsons emerged into the sunlight. "Thank you all for your support," Monique said into the forest of microphones. "Today, justice was served not just for me, but for everyone who has experienced abuse of power." She paused, collecting her thoughts. But a guilty verdict is just the beginning. Real change requires more than punishment, it requires transformation. She gestured to Chief Thompson, who stepped forward. The former police chief had become an unlikely ally, working closely with the Wilson Justice Initiative since his retirement. "Today, I'm proud to announce that our police department has completely overhauled its training program," he said. "With Dr. Wilson's guidance, we've implemented new protocols for de-escalation, implicit bias training, and community engagement." Monique nodded. and the Wilson Justice Initiative has secured funding to expand these reforms to police departments nationwide. We're also providing scholarships for young people from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in law enforcement and criminal justice reform. A young woman approached, holding a small child. It was the wife of the plumber from the jury, their 4-year-old daughter clutching a drawing she'd made. "My husband told me how brave you were," she said quietly, handing the picture to Monique. "Our daughter wants to be a doctor now. Like you." Monique knelt to the child's level, accepting the colorful drawing of a woman in a white coat. "You can be anything you want to be," she told the little girl, "and I'll be cheering for you." As the crowd dispersed, Anthony wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. "Ready to go home?" Monique looked around at the courthouse steps, where their journey through the justice system had begun and now, in some ways, ended. Tomorrow, she would return to surgery, back to saving lives in her operating room. But her work for justice would continue alongside her medical career. "Yes," she said, feeling truly at peace for the first time in 6 months. "I'm ready." Together, they walked down the steps and into a future that, while forever changed by one officer's terrible mistake, now held the promise of something better, not just for them, but for everyone who would come after.